Hello, welcome to Channel 2019 News. This just in, breaking news. Mrs. Ananias' APUSH class is researching the life of the immigrant. I will bring you the first part of the story. The Gilded Age is a term used to describe the time period from 1870 to 1900, or more generally, the late 19th century. The term was coined by Mark Twain, implying that on the surface the period was glittery and shining, but underneath it was not all that bright. In fact, it was shady. This corruption and shadiness made it hard for immigrants who were coming to the United States for a better life of more opportunities to actually achieve all those opportunities. And now we go to Angela with information on the new wave of immigration.
Thanks, Grace. Now we have the new wave of immigration. The new wave of immigrants were the people who came to the U.S. at the start of the 20th century, mostly from Southern or Eastern European countries like Italy, Croatia, Slovakia, Greece, and Poland. Many people immigrated to the U.S. An estimated 30 million immigrants came to the United States in the 19th and the 20th centuries. The people of the new generation had a harder time assimilating into the culture compared to the old immigrants. The newer immigrants looked for factory jobs and were urban city dwellers as opposed to farming and agricultural jobs that many people from the old generation had.
And now we'll talk about the correlation between the Second Industrial Revolution and the new wave of immigrants. The Second Industrial Revolution brought about rapid urbanization, and cities became increasingly populated by new immigrants. New wave immigrants were drawn to the abundance of jobs in the cities. They were also drawn to the cities because of the seemingly low cost of living. After the Civil War, steel became king, which in turn provided thousands of jobs in factories to make the steel and many more jobs to construct things with the steel. Railroad companies also stimulated the mighty stream of immigration, seeking settlers to whom their land grants might be sold at a profit.
Let's talk about home life for immigrants in the Gilded Age. Most housing conditions were deplorable. The 1879 perfection of the Dunwall-style tenement only made things more crowded and unsanitary. Several families were sardined onto each floor of the barracks-like structures. Cheap labor meant immigrants living in these slums were quite prone to losing a job due to injury. This meant the unemployed swarmed around the tenements in so-called flop houses, where they could sleep for a few cents. The close quarters made the immigrants especially vulnerable to disease and disaster.
Now on to work life. For the new immigrants, there was a constant fear of unemployment, especially because there was a concern that the workers would be replaced by machines. Owner-employee relations deteriorated, and the factory hand was employed by a corporation. Hazardous working conditions made having a job unpleasant for immigrants, since workplace accidents were common. Workers would not receive workers' compensation or life insurance, and companies claimed no responsibility for injuries. Workers received also very low wages. Unskilled workers received $10 per week and worked very long hours. Textile workers worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Labor unions too became prevalent during the Gilded Age. In order to make change, workers formed labor unions to try to get their voices heard. Unions became very popular after the Civil War, and by 1872 there were several 100,000 organized workers and 32 national unions representing such crafts as bricklayers, typesetters, and shoemakers. Wow, that was quite the blast from the past. Now I'll talk to you about some newer immigration information. According to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, a refugee coming into the United States is defined as someone who is located outside of the United States, is of special humanitarian concern to the United States, and demonstrates that they are persecuted or fear persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group.
Thanks, Grace, for that fascinating information. And now, the conflict and crisis in Syria has caused many refugees to come to the U.S., especially in the past 5 years. This year will be its 8th year in a civil war, and as the war continues, the increasing number of people that are suffering also continues. The crisis started in May 2011. Syria democratic activists started protests against the government, which is run by Bashar al-Assad. After the protests began in 2011, the government cracked back by killing hundreds of people and putting many more in prison. A rebel military group that supported democracy called the Free Syrian Army was then formed, and thus the revolution began. Since 2011, over 12 million, half of the country's population pre-war, have been displaced from their home. Many have fled to first asylum countries, as well as European countries and the U.S. And now we go to Maggie.
Thank you, Angela. And now some information about Sudanese immigrants. In Sudan, the country began a civil war shortly after its independence. Even though it split in 2011, clashes between the government and the rebels continue, leading many to flee, fearing the violence. This conflict has claimed the lives of thousands and prompted millions to flee from their homes. Now nearly 4 million people have been displaced from their homes, with about half choosing to flee the borders as refugees. Most of the refugees now dwell in neighboring countries like Ethiopia and Uganda. Today, the conflict continues to displace Sudanese citizens, and millions of refugees remain. And now to Kate.
And now some information on Cuban immigration to the United States. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a huge surge of immigrants coming from Cuba to the United States as a result of the Castros assuming power and the dominant presence of communism in Cuba. With Castro's reign came fear, and many Cubans fled for the United States to escape persecution for their political beliefs. They also left Cuba for the United States in hope that they would have control over their own lives. This mass migration was called the Cuban exile. As political, social, and economic conditions became worse in Soviet-controlled Cuba, more and more people fled in fear of their freedom being taken away in the 1960s and 70s. Over 1.4 million people migrated from Cuba to the United States, and over 1 million exiles still remain.
From Vietnam and 5 years ago from somewhere. Mostly for education and other thing. The environment from the US is way better than Vietnam. The actual journey it's not that hard. It's just a flight, right? And other than that, preparing the paperwork to get here is really take a while. Like I need paperwork to send from the school accepting me as a student to Vietnam and setting up the paperwork for the visa. It took around 6 months. Mostly for adapting to a really new environment. School, food, the language is way different, and I haven't really speak English until actually arriving here.
Thank you for tuning in on Channel 2019 News.
We hope you enjoyed learning about immigration in the Gilded Age and now.